Hello, dear friends. Today is July 7th, Monday, and at the beginning of this video, I would like to make a small administrative announcement. From the previous video on the channel, there was a synchronized translation into English, which YouTube does automatically. In order to switch from the Russian version to English, you need to go to Settings, select Audio, and set the English translation. Now this is, so to speak, a positive news. Apparently this news has been carried out by a certain Sumber. Now YouTube automatically translates the title of the headlines of my videos into the language of the country in which this video is shown. That is, in Ukraine, this should be written in the Ukrainian language, in Belarus, in Belarusian, in German. I don't know how this actually happens. But there is some confusion. Therefore, if someone wants to receive, as before, headlines in Russian, in order to understand what this new video is about, I will release, at the same time with the video, red cards with the name in Russian, as before. Therefore, if anyone wants to receive these red cards, you need to subscribe to the channel, because these cards will be distributed only by subscribers. As I noticed, the number of views in the video on the channel is about 30%, those who regularly watch but have not subscribed. I understand that there are different reasons, especially I understand the reasons in such countries as the Russian Federation and Belarus. So look, your safety and peace are the most important. If you are not concerned about this problem, then subscribe and you will receive these red cards at the same time with the release of the video. But now let's move on to the main part. This video will be a significant continuation of the previous one. That is, an analysis of the situation, since the previous video received an unexpected continuation. The next day after the release of my video based on the analysis of the statement of the Foreign Minister of China, Wang, the General Secretary of NATO, Rutte, entered this discussion. Moreover, he did not refer to the statement of Wang. From what he said, it seems that he took a piece of my interpretation of Wang's interview and put his view on the situation. But to make it clear, this is a fundamental question. This is a very important question. Here it is necessary to figure out to the end, in this case, to determine the correct strategy so that we do not manipulate the forces that are considered allied to us. In short, I will remind you my interpretation of Wang's interview. The war in Ukraine that Putin started was actually sanctioned by China. This is the proxy of the war, Putin vassal, who, at the request of the blessing of the Chinese leadership, is leading this war. Not in the hands of Putin, but in Ukraine, China is leading a hybrid war against the United States in America to tie hands with the United States and distract them from China, from Southeast Asia, a classic operation to divert attention and efforts to another object. That is, Ukraine is a platform of a hybrid war that China is leading against the United States of America. Ukraine is behind the United States of America, participating in this war against all evil: China, Russia, Korea, Iran. Further, I said that if Ukraine, the force of insufficient help from its allies, if Ukraine, God forbid, loses this war, and China needs the war of Russia on the eastern flank of NATO and Eastern Europe to continue as long as possible, then Putin moves to NATO. That is, the interpretation of the interview of the United Nations proves that if Ukraine loses, Russia will definitely invade Eastern Europe, the countries of NATO. In this, they used to think about whether to enter or not. Now, from the statement of the United Nations, it is clear as God's day. Well, and then there is an invasion, and under this invasion already in Europe, when the United States forces will be distracted, the fifth article is supposed to be, by and large, should be in theory. The ideas of the United States are involved. At that time, China annexed Taiwan to itself. That was my concept. Now, what does Rutte do? Rutte takes the second part, the second phase of this operation of China, of the war. That is, he does not say a word about Ukraine, although in an eye he spoke only about Ukraine. He did not say a word about Europe, about the coordination of military actions of China and Moscow. He spoke only applicable in the context of Ukraine, not a word about Europe. Rutte replaced the word Ukraine with Europe, so he said that if China will bless Putin's interests in Europe, Jinping will call, give him direct orders and start. This is, of course, every owner of their own interpretation, but from my point of view, the interpretation of Mr. Rutte, with all my respect, I really respect. I believe that INSEC is a good, reliable ally. May God give him success in his noble cause, the provision of help to Ukraine. But in terms of interpretation, an important interpretation, because it immediately bypassed all the rest of the mass media of the West, the United States, Europe. Here somehow he showed a strange, I would say, uniformity. First of all, I repeat once again, he did not say a word about Europe, he spoke about Ukraine. Only Europe appeared during the Rutte. I understand he is the General Secretary of NATO. His concern is NATO and, first of all, European countries. He needs to ensure the preparation in the NATO military plan for the possible invasion of Russia, what NATO is preparing for, and for this he needs to prepare the population. There needs to be a real revolution in the heads of Europeans, European citizens. Well, Rutte needs to be supported by the United States. That is, in fact, he exposes the interpretation of the Chinese minister in this way. He actually sends a signal to the United States. If anything, we are your first far post. We will stand on barricades defending you, therefore you must help us now. This is the signal of the Trump administration, like do not leave, but rather help more, save the fifth article, and so on. I understand all this, but the negative from my point of view in such an interpretation is the following. Ukraine, it seems to be a local conflict. Something is happening there. It is not part of the development of the general strategic situation in Europe and in the world. This is according to his interpretation, Mr. Rutte. In fact, this is radically wrong. From my point of view, which I published a day before Mr. Rutte made his interpretation, I said that aggression against Ukraine is only the first phase of China's plan against Europe. And Ukraine is Europe, so this is the first phase, which is now carried out in a hybrid way. China is in the hands of Putin. A hybrid war against the United States on the same issue, the issue of Taiwan, and in general, the weakness of the United States in a hybrid way. And the second phase, which Mr. Rutte called the first, I forgot about Ukraine. It will become possible only in the event of a defeat by Ukraine. Putin will not climb and China will not force him to climb into NATO countries, Eastern Europe, until Ukraine is defeated, as he dreams of it. Because if he tries to do it, let's say now, then what he was afraid of will happen, because of which he allegedly began the war. Then quickly NATO and the United States transfer their missiles to the territory of Ukraine, and that's it. They transfer as many weapons as they need, and NATO strikes from the territory of Ukraine into a soft, shaking Russia. That's it, the end, catastrophe. That is, Rutte's option is possible only if Ukraine loses. Therefore, Ukraine is now what Mr. Rutte is trying to present to Europe. Ukraine is already at war, it is already in action. There is no need to wait for anything, you just need to understand that this is just an integral part of the plan. Of China, Putin and the evil axis against the United States, against Europe, and now Ukraine is at the forefront. Therefore, when it comes to the preparation of the alliance's fortification, we need to get out of this. You can talk as much as you want about the alliance's fortification, but if Ukraine is not provided with sufficient help and Ukraine, God forbid, loses this war, the axis of evil, namely the axis of evil. Because, as practice has shown, without China, North Korea, Iran, Russia could not even free its own territory in the Kurdish region. If, God forbid, Ukraine loses this war, the axis of evil, then, as Brzezinski said, Russia potentially becomes almost an empire before the empire. Having taken all the resources of Ukraine, the most important thing, one of the best, or perhaps the best in terms of intellectual warfare. Preparations for the modern war of 1921, the armed forces of Ukraine. And how Hitler, do you remember, acted? Yes, actually before Hitler, Napoleon. Napoleon first conquered almost all of Europe, then gathered from there and formed an army of 11 languages, in my opinion, 11 or 12 languages. And then he went to Russia. Hitler did about the same thing. He had divisions from Norwegian soldiers and so on. And if Putin captures Ukraine, then puts Ukrainian military under his gun, and this armada gets involved in Europe, then there will be a problem. Therefore, everything that Mr. Rutte thought, thanks to his noble, necessary, rational intentions, preparation, strengthening, all this needs to be done now at the maximum pace, because then it will be too late, extremely late. I think that the Ukrainian diplomacy should explain all this to Mr. Rutte. That is, you understand, this interview or speech by Wang, he said a lot, and his conversations during this tour in Western Europe. They were like a cold shower for Europeans. They did not hear this and did not expect it. Now the forum is expected in about 2 weeks. The European Union, China, they had to hug, conclude a profitable deal, agree. But here the cold soul from Beijing and the Chinese do not spoil, by and large, do not spoil with these cold souls. And then here you are, this is what he said, he needs to say thank you for this. First of all, he woke up, he told how in fact, now the Chinese are already refusing to say that they did not understand us. It was a secret that he revealed, it must be used in full. And in order for this strategic goal of Western politicians in Europe to explain to their citizens what it means and what awaits them, if they do not understand the need for an urgent, forced development of the military industry and the help of Ukraine, first of all, then the situation will be very bad. They write to me, in what state did Ivan I suddenly make such a statement? In fact, he told almost a military secret, a bourgeois one. You know, this is so, by and large, and I think the main problem is the following. Xi Jinping apparently is really very ill, seriously ill, and he is ill in such a way that it is unlikely that he will be completely cured. Therefore, according to some mass media, he is already delegating a significant part of his powers to his closest assistants. Xi Jinping's closest assistant in foreign policy is Wang Yi, and this Wang Yi is the closest, the most pro-Kremlin person in Chinese leadership. That is, he had been in this position for a long time and was in the mood of bilateral relations. He was preparing meetings between Putin and Xi Jinping. He knows everything. Of course, the Russians treated him like a bride, like the most valuable guest and friend, and there were stories when the Russians really helped him. You know, the special services have a system to work out how they promote their person to the very top in the leadership of another country. We talked about this many times when we discussed the situation in Ukraine. As for Wang Yi, you probably remember that somewhere in 1923, Wang Yi was replaced by the Chinese ambassador to Washington, Qinggang. And Wang Yi was transferred to a higher position, to the Central Committee, such as the Politburo, which they have an organization equivalent to the Soviet Politburo, where the main mastodons sit, but they generate ideas, make strategic decisions, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs embodies them in life. So this Qinggang, he was pro-Western, I would say, or just a healthy person. And with his arrival, there was some kind of revolution in China's foreign policy. The doors began to open in the direction of the West. And this, for sure, caused a very large alarm in the Kremlin. And about 6 months passed, and suddenly this Qinggang was removed with a crack, with a position. In addition, well, they were removed in the style of the late 30s of the last century in the Soviet Union. That is, he not only disappeared from the field of view, but his names were removed from the documents that were even adopted during the time when he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, so that even the spirit of his name would not remain as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the country. Well, we went to the West to talk, that is, to China. We assumed, we hinted that there was corruption. Well, so with such, indignation, I would say, he was cut out like an axe from the history of the latest China, his name. And that the journalists from Financial Times in this also took part in the Japanese information agency Nikkei, another number of major publications came to the following conclusion, that he was assigned a connection, an intimate connection with a Chinese journalist who was more than 10 years old. She allegedly had a child, but this is also not a reason, not a reason for a person with such indifference to shut down, not from the political arena but from the history of the country. Allegedly, information was received that she is an agent of the MI6. And allegedly, this information about the bad connections of Qinggang was delivered to Beijing to Xi Jinping, the ambassador from Moscow. That's how it happened, and then once again, Wang Yi returns to the position of foreign minister, and his line continues. That is, he is, one might say, the Putin of the Chinese leadership. And now Xi Jinping's health has improved a little, a fight between his closest comrades has begun. And apparently, the result of this was this leak. That is, apparently there was a signal, such a harsh signal, that China firmly holds the course of cooperation within the framework of the evil axis. And there will be no positive turns in the direction of the West. This is what I think is the meaning of all this. In this context, a series of questions arises, I would say. First, it is fundamentally important, I think, both Ukrainian media and Ukrainian diplomacy to delicately correct Mr. Rutte. That the war he is talking about, which may come to Europe, it has been going on since February 22. This is the first phase. And there is a terrible thing, an unprecedented number of missile strikes, UAVs. Not every day of the Second World War can be compared to what is happening now on the territory of Ukraine, and this is happening on the eastern flank of NATO. That is, what he warned about may begin, it has already begun. Therefore, it is necessary to prepare together, and Ukraine is not a local conflict somewhere on the periphery. This is part of the systemic war that is now brewing. And then I will tell him in detail what it all means. That is, Ukraine, I repeat, Ukraine is part of Europe, in fact, de facto, part of NATO. And from Ukraine, from the fact that something will happen depends on the fate of Europe and NATO. Well, in general, the distance, the force in general. And in general, whether the Third World War will be thermonuclear or not. By and large, now depends on what is happening in Ukraine. And now, in developing this topic, I want to share with you a brief content of a recent interview that was given by Radio Times. You know, there is such a newspaper, the famous British The Times. And it has a radio, and there are regularly large specialists in various areas. This time, there was George Barros, a leading analyst of the Institute for the Study of the War of Washington, which probably everyone knows. And I must say that he is one of the stars and one of the stars' leading specialists in this institute. In terms of the theory of war, the practice of war, in terms of Ukraine, Russia, and the Russian aggression in Ukraine. He graduated from the brilliant William and Mary College here in Virginia. It is the most difficult problem to get there. They don't take morons there, and they don't take money on a large scale, as far as I know. After that, he worked in the Congress, in the Committee on Foreign Affairs, on practical work. And now he is an analyst. This is the person who briefs, consults the biggest American military leaders, politicians. About the war that is now taking place in the territory of Ukraine. Therefore, this is the person who should be listened to, and I listened carefully, made a detailed report. I think you will be interested because it will expose what is happening and what will happen, and what is included in what Van E said. And in the analysis that we did, and by and large the analysis of Mr. Rutte, so Josh Barrs, his speech, Times Radio. The cunning of the Russian summer campaign. According to his words, the offensive, a widely advertised Russian offensive in the summer of 1925, is not effective. Russia crawls with difficulty breaking through. In the Soviet Union, they make counterattacks. There were even cases when they won back. He called, in my opinion, 2 small villages or settlements. That is, if there are no operational breakthroughs on the part of the orcs, there are tactical successes, which sometimes are not even the capture of small villages. It is the capture of just the territory, the uninhabited territory, the fields, simply speaking. Well, he, as an example, makes an offensive in the Sumy direction, which, in his words, is swinging, and Ukraine has even taken part of the occupied territories, his prediction. This summer offensive Russian this year is an operational failure, no chance of significant strategic success. Why, he explains. Well, initially Putin made a stupid, serious mistake. He violated the military doctrine, the Russian military doctrine, and began the war without mobilization. Having assembled 120 battalion technical groups, he smashed them together, which were not well prepared. He scattered military officers among them, and this led to the destruction of the officer corps to a significant extent and the loss of professional personnel, which scattered among these. 120 battalion technical groups gathered from those who signed on the subscription for money, but without any experience. What's going on? Why did he do such an unforgivable thing? But this is not stupid. This is the result of his thinking. This is the conclusion that he came up with in various situations. Putin is afraid of full-fledged mobilization, and this is important to understand. He prefers mercenaries, he prefers to pay higher salaries, sometimes crazy salaries. And these are not only problems on the battlefield, these are also problems in the economy, and complex problems in the economy, which arose in connection with such a formation of personnel, of the living force. Well, this explains the need to use the North Koreans. From this, the leadership of the Soviet Union probably comes to an end in its analysis of what Putin will do next and what can be opposed to him. What else happened? There was a tactical revolution with the help of unmanned vehicles. I told you about this on the basis of the analysis of this innovation that appeared on the battlefields of Ukraine, which was made by one of the Israeli generals. The point is that these BPLs and their technical capabilities, they literally broke the doctrine that existed before, which provided training, a single fist in a certain place, strike, mass, tanks, aviation, other armored vehicles. This is what they were talking about. This is a general military operation, in the form of which the offensive was planned in the Soviet Union in the spring of 1923. The emergence of the BPLAs and their emergence is massive, almost like a raven. They are flying in a flock. It all broke, because it turns out that the enemy cannot reach, as they say, the zero line of the front cannot assemble its troops and bring it there, because while they are moving there, moving out while approaching, the BPLAs destroy them on the way. A completely different view of military actions now. Operational maneuver, or this joint military operation, as Mr. Barros said, is lost art. You see, this is a revolution, in fact, and what he says is a revolution. Because this operational maneuver has been operating since the time of the Second World War and existed until the development of technology, development of operational skills in the Soviet Union did not break. This centuries-old tradition of joint military operational maneuver or joint military operation, well, the new front line, it is now reminiscent of the First World War. That is, the dead zone. There are these devices that destroy everything alive. And as I wrote, I remember this Israeli general, everything that appears there in this zone, which he called the crater of death, with a diameter of approximately 45 kilometers. What gets there, whether it is a technique or a living force, the duration of this existence is about 15 minutes. But it must be said that not only Ukraine, but also Russia are adapting to this. The Russians began to move on the buggy on motorcycles in this zone. It does not always succeed, but nevertheless, both sides are moving. Further, developing new methods of conducting military actions. Another new phenomenon, Ukrainian strikes on the backs of the Russian Federation. The DPRK strikes on military infrastructure in the depths of Russia. However, there is a lack of a strategic link between strikes in the depths and the offensive at the front. I would note it, a brilliant strike somewhere in the Crimea, the base is turned, or the same web. It would be necessary to do it so well that it was accompanied by a simultaneous offensive somewhere on the battlefield, with an attack on a specific settlement, in order to beat it off. That is, not just to bomb there, although this is extremely useful and necessary, but also to push the enemy back to the battlefield. The war has turned into an experimental range of new types of weapons, new techniques, new tactics, strategies, but remains a problem of weak operational planning, and this tells about insufficient training of personnel. That is, from the practical point of view, people, the command line goes forward, develops, but it is felt that insufficient fundamental basic training. Humanitarian and moral aspects are important, which have appeared in the course of these military actions. Russia is aiming at civil infrastructure. The goal is an attempt at demoralization. The expert is definitely sure that this will not work, but this, in fact, as the Second World War showed that it does not work. When the Allies strained, their strikes were at the peak in the Russian region. Germany at that time was releasing military equipment at the peak. As for Ukraine, as the author says, this will never work in principle, because for Ukraine this war is an existential issue, not a political one. This is a matter of survival of the country, survival of the nation. And this was supported by the Kremlin's curse, which stated that there is no such thing in the Ukrainian nation. And its goal, all these nats and so on, all this nonsense, stupid Kremlin, this is all evidence of this, so to speak, convoluted form of the explanation of the goal, which consists of assimilating, destroying, assimilating the remains and wiping out the Ukrainian nation from the face of the earth. We are talking about genocide, the whole doctrine that is now being proclaimed both from the Kremlin and from the Kremlin's slums, strategic consequences and global prospects. Western defense industry is not ready for high-efficiency war, intensiveness. Lack of Patriot missiles, deficit of 155 missiles. The USA uses such days every day, but it says they're from 20 to 25,000 drones a day. I mean not only those that are launched in the corner of the Russian territory, but in general on the battlefield. The Americans counted such fighting days, when the USA used up to 25,000 drones on the battlefield every day. At the same time, the U.S. armed forces in America are planning to fill the division with thousands. Each division corresponding to the U.S., the Armenian, is planned to receive up to 1,000 drones. That is, a drop in the sea, just a drop in the sea. Well, I will remind you now, the country is led by the United States as an aristocracy. From all these problems, they are as distant as ever. The defense minister of the United States has no idea about these needs. He is now fighting with transgenders and all this torture. Well, let's talk a little further on this topic. Globally, at present, the world is experiencing three major conflicts. It means Ukraine, then the Middle East, and the raging conflict is Southeastern Asia. That is, some of them, two of these are already, were potentially born in Southeastern Asia, a potential source of conflict. According to the assessment of the group that deals with this problem in the Institute for the Study of War, the war in Ukraine will most likely last for many more months. He said that this will be at least another 2 years of the usual war in Ukraine. That is, a war that will be conducted with conventional weapons. In 2025, he believes there will be no long-term truce that can potentially lead to peace. Here is such a strategic assessment against the background of glaring hopes or efforts. In some circles, probably some officials have about Russian opportunities or prospects of Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in Istanbul. In this context, a fundamental question arises. Is it worth it? That is, it would be useful to assess against the background of these assessments if there is any sense in supporting this myth or bluff. That these contacts of Ukraine, Russian in Istanbul or somewhere else, can now lead to a positive result. It is necessary to understand who is profitable in this mess, allegedly leading the negotiations. In fact, they are not. Putin tells Trump with this mess that we are leading the negotiations, we are behind the diplomatic settlement. At this time, he continues his offensive in the hope of biting off another kilometer of Ukrainian territory. He says this is an actor. He speaks from the West and most likely from the United States. We did not do anything to try to convince Putin to stop trying to achieve achievements in the battlefield. He means to convince him with real actions by providing such help to Ukraine, with the help of which Ukraine could strike. Such a blow to the orcs which made Putin understand that it is a shame to continue to make these attempts and hope for a positive result for him. And so far as George Barros estimates, Putin is still motivated to continue to go further. And here is a very important thought, gentlemen. The world is entering the phase of the moment of 1937. That is, this pre-war atmosphere. Pre-war means before the World War and many points of tension. Barra says, had a period of about 80 years. It was a period of relative stability of the global world, which began in 1945. It was an anomaly in human experience, that is, such a long period of the world, and we need to prepare for the worst scenarios of the transition to the future. This is how he formulated the current situation in the world. What does it mean by and large the moment of 1937? This is already not Barros speaking, but collected various sources. Historical context, what was it? Firstly, this is the culmination of interwar tension. That is, this is between the two wars, the First and the Second World War. Japan began full-scale aggression against China. This is an incident on the Luguoqiao Bridge near Beijing. It happened on July 7, 1937. And after this shelling, or rather shelling, which went into an artillery duel, and after that Japan went to open invasion into continental China. Before that, from 1931, they captured and controlled Manchuria, and now they invaded China and captured Beijing. And now the Chinese consider the beginning of World War II, July 7, 1937. The majority of the people, the majority of the countries outside of China, the Southeast, probably do not even suspect this. This is what is happening in China with Japan in 1937. Japan at this time accelerates militarization of the country, and Hitler eliminates internal opponents. He had the command of the land forces. In my opinion, this is the job of Field Marshal Blomberg. Then there was Fritsch, another major warhead. They were against the preparation of Germany's advance into the Second World War. They believed that Germany was not ready. In 1937, Italy strengthens expansion in Ethiopia. Spain is a bloody civil war. The League of Nations is paralyzed. The United States keeps isolationism. The USSR cleans up, getting ready for a direct collision. That is, this is a threshold. 1937 is a threshold before a systematic big war. When everyone sees that a terrible catastrophe is coming, but political elites of the corresponding countries avoid mobilization. Some do not understand, others think that maybe it will be carried out. Global institutes like the League of Nations have lost their authority. No one wants to be the first to throw a glove, and here is this analogy. The year is 1937, and what corresponds to this in 1925? Now Germany is strengthening Wehrmacht. At present, China has tripled its defense budget and is building a fleet at a furious pace. In addition, it is also increasing the number of nuclear missiles on the ground base at a furious pace. By the way, in 1937, Japan opens a front in China, 1925. Iran and China push the proxy fronts in Yemen. Ukraine, Putin's proxy, Russia's proxy, it's China's vassals. China pushes these proxy fronts through them, Taiwan. In 1937, the United States is busy with internal problems and isolationism. Currently, the United States is reducing military aid to allies, to Ukraine, to Taiwan. And again, isolationism, complete misunderstanding among the so-called elites of what is going on and what needs to be done. There is some kind of idiotic passion for idiotic reasons reigns, in general, as in the early days of Qinggang. In 1937, the League of Nations lost its functions. In 1925, the UN and NATO were unable to stop the aggressors. In 1937, Spain was a testing ground. In 1935, Ukraine was a modern analog, as some analysts believe, of Spain in 1936–1939, and all this is the key idea. We live in the prelude to global turbulence, as analysts delicately call it, the coming dark predictions, but the elites still act in the logic of local conflicts and hope to solve them using tactical solutions. And by the way, this is what I started today's video about Ukraine. These are local conflicts. Why local? Because if it is accepted, recognized as such, which it is, that this is the beginning already. Like the Chinese say that the Lagosian Bridge was the beginning of the Second World War. If you then understood this, then maybe the war would have gone differently. I don't know how, but probably differently. The British leadership was closing their eyes. How much Churchill was fighting there. They say that it is necessary to prepare for the war. They closed their eyes. They hoped that everything would somehow be understood and all this would be carried out. There are practical solutions, but something like that, well, it will be blown up, but not before that. There are more important things. That's how it is. That is, as in 1937, the so-called elites got through in the face of world turbulence. So, in fact, this is happening now. I recently remembered here when Rutte spoke as if there was no, it seems, a major war on the European continent, on the territory of Ukraine. I remembered the situation of the 90s, the beginning of the 2000s in Russia, namely the First and Second Chechen Wars in Russia. These were actually, in my opinion, colonial wars, which the colony, that is, the metropolis of Moscow, tried to hold the territory that had been for several centuries its composition as a colony, now tried to hold it. In the 1960s, when the West lost its colonies in Africa and before that in Asia. So you remember how the Chechens fought. I have good contacts with the Chechens who fought as close comrades of duty. Many still write to me good words that Dudiv uttered towards Ukraine. Well, you know, it was heroic resistance, completely unequal weapons. That is, on the one hand, the falling Russian army armed with teeth, on the other hand, the heroism and military skill of the Chechen people. And the West, it was horrified by what Russia was doing there. And it is precisely the Chechen, especially the Chechen War, that made the countries, freed from the Warsaw Treaty, from the Socialist Alliance of Eastern Europe, to bow down to NATO, to try to ask, to demand, like Poland blackmailing, that otherwise we will work on the acquisition of nuclear weapons. That's where it came from. That is, it is not necessary, like some bullshit now, including some so-called intellectuals, in particular Jeffrey Sachs, who said that it was a stupid mistake of the White House that NATO was expanded. It was not the White House that expanded NATO, but the countries of Eastern Europe. Seeing what the Russians are doing in Chechnya, they rushed into this NATO. And then some officials, diplomatic representatives of other circles in contact with representatives of the Chechen resistance, asked them, well, how long will you be able to hold out? Not giving them anything, you remember, they did not provide any help to the West or NATO, to the Chechens. How long will you be able to hold out? Well, the Chechen combat guys, yes, as much as you need, as much as you can hold out, we will hold out until the end and so on. I don't understand that in the end, enthusiasm, heroism will sooner or later give way to rude iron power. Do you understand? Stupid, stupid. Here, it would be necessary to somehow avoid the situation. I thought, listening and reading Ryot's statements, his interpretation of the speech, 1E now, so that it does not happen. Like with Chechnya, like how are you guys going to hold out for a long time if we do not give you enough weapons? You need to mobilize, guys, just mobilize. Ukraine is not a local conflict. This is already part of the European war, and you are the second phase is yours. If Ukraine does not let God lose, in addition, in the second phase, you will have absolutely no chance, because the current administration of the United States will not cover you with any nuclear umbrella. It must be said that, as follows from the interpretation of the interview of George Barros and the last materials that attract attention. De facto, life itself makes the elites sleep in the West, take reasonable measures. Well, in particular, drones, the drone revolution, which led to the revolution in strategy and tactics. Then, while the official alliances are cracking, or simply do not work, frankly do not work, the crossing of the de facto alliances began. These are already new forms of alliances. I called them to you, not particularly calling them participants. These are so-called military technical companies and advanced companies of artificial intelligence, which connects artificial intelligence with technology, in particular with drones. And the last example is the signing of a contract with the company of Eric Schmidt. The company is called SwiftBit, which was founded in 1923. And for a long time, it was a secret company. They closed it with a whole structure to cover it, but you can't completely hide such things. It became known. That is, these are new forms of private VPC which have acquired a global scale. I would bring here another company like Anduril, then Palantir. That is, these are new companies of global scale, which are spread not only in one country, but they are even spread beyond the continents. And thank God they are with Ukraine. Well, the United States, on the other hand, is still playing the role of an unprepared empire. Political split, isolationism, and depopulation of military obligations, all this makes Washington a weak player. How to determine? Military theorists here have set a whole set of signs that can be determined by the transition of the enemy representatives of the evil axis to the second phase. Ukraine is the first, the second is when the invasion of Eastern Europe into NATO countries is already being prepared. Approximately what can serve as a sign? In the field of energy, first of all, the blows, as it is believed, will be applied on the so-called energy platform. That is, it will be explosions of pipelines, attacks by drones on the windmills, disconnection from underwater highways that the cables pass under the bottom of the Baltic Sea, connects the internet with various countries and groups of countries. In the information sector, there will be an increase in the number of deepfakes, that is, separate statements of the head of state which are not so different from the external ones, and people will be breaking people's heads for a long time. Is this true? Is it not true? Until they spend time on this, the enemy will achieve their goals. Then they will be prepared to be brought into the infarct space, all sorts of ferocious videos about the rebellion in the enemies. Armies, false orders about retreat, and so on, and so on, and so on. Here is such, gentlemen, a tense situation, but I am inspired by Optimism that in the background of decadence, numbness, inaction from the absence of clear thinking and professionalism, which reigns. In the state of Western countries and alliances are gaining incredible momentum. Here are these new alliances from. Private companies of the VPC, which by and large are associated with the existing ones, with the same NATO, with other alliances. And they can do more themselves within the framework of this official, formal alliance than the formal official alliance itself. And the work is in full swing. And it is not in vain that it is noted that Ukraine is now at the forefront of the scientific and technical progress of the military region. And it is believed that this leadership for Ukraine will be preserved, and this, in turn, is considered to be a guarantee of the success of the upcoming military actions. Well, I still hope, gentlemen, that life will make the United States, even the current administration, in the end, reconcile with reality, stop fantasizing, and finally really look life in the eyes. That is, somehow, people who have no idea what they are doing and what is going on around their duties should separate from the administration. And this will allow the United States to increase the help and support of Europe, while it will finally make a decisive leap. Well, I think, remember, in one of the videos I quoted one of the European leaders who said, "We know what to do." I mean the political leadership of the European Union and NATO, we know what to do. And the most important task is to convince the people of the voters so that they understand that what we do is in their interests and aimed at their protection, at the protection of their security. I hope they will cope with this task one way or another. That's it, dear friends. Let me finish today's video. As always, glory to Ukraine and the armed forces. The enemy will be defeated, the victory will be ours. I wish you, my dear friends, endurance, courage, and firm faith in our inevitable victory. See you soon.